Ndidiamika's wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but instead it turned into her greatest humiliation. In front of guests, music and laughter, her husband suddenly grabbed her by the arm and dragged her out of the reception hall. People gasped, cameras clicked, and whispers filled the room. He shouted at her, accusing her of not being good enough for him, making her feel small while everyone watched. Her dress tore slightly as he pushed her outside, leaving her standing in tears on the steps while guests murmured in shock, unsure of what had just happened. Inside, he returned proudly as if he had won, expecting the event to continue without her. Minutes later, the doors opened again, and Ndidiamika walked back in with her head held high. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her was a well-dressed lawyer carrying a black folder. The music stopped, and everyone turned to stare. The same woman who was dragged out in shame returned with a calm smile. The lawyer opened the folder and handed her a stack of documents. With steady hands, she raised the papers and announced the shocking truth. The entire wedding venue, the grand hall filled with crystal chandeliers and golden tables, belonged to her. Her late father had left it in her name, and the lawyer confirmed it with signatures and stamps. The room fell into complete silence. Her husband's confident grin disappeared instantly. His arrogance turned into panic as he realized he had just humiliated the very woman who owned the place he was standing in. Guests who once pitied her now looked at him with disgust, whispering about his cruelty and his foolishness. Ndidiamika didn't need to shout or argue. Her proof spoke louder than any words. She walked to the center of the hall, her torn dress still trailing behind her, but her dignity shining brighter than ever. The same crowd that had watched her humiliation now clapped for her strength. Some cheered, others took videos, capturing the unbelievable twist of fate. Her husband tried to speak, but no one listened anymore. Ndidiamika had turned the pain into power. She stood tall, proving that no matter how hard someone tried to disgrace her, she was far stronger than their cruelty. In that moment, she was no longer just a bride. She was the true owner, the woman who rose above shame and turned it into victory. Ayanda had tried to stay calm all through the family gathering, but her in-laws never missed a chance to mock her. They whispered behind her back, laughed at her clothes, and made cruel comments about her place in the family. Finally, in front of everyone, her husband's relatives dragged her from her chair and pushed her toward the door. The room filled with laughter and gossip as she stumbled out, tears welling in her eyes. They called her an outsider, saying she had no right to be in the grand mansion that wasn't hers. She felt the sting of humiliation as guests looked away, pretending not to notice. Her heart pounded, but deep inside she knew something they didn't. Minutes later, Ayanda returned, but this time she wasn't alone. At her side was her late father's lawyer, carrying a briefcase that held the truth. The loud chatter stopped the moment the lawyer stepped forward. All eyes turned to Ayanda, expecting her to come back broken, but instead she walked in with quiet confidence. The lawyer opened the briefcase and pulled out documents, stamped and signed, with her father's name on them. In a steady voice, the lawyer explained that before his passing, Ayanda's father had made sure she inherited the very mansion where the family was gathered. The silence in the room was heavy as the truth sank in. Those who had dragged her moments ago now stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. The same relatives who mocked her for being nothing were suddenly realizing she was the true owner of the roof over their heads. Ayanda lifted the papers high for everyone to see, her tears now replaced by a victorious smile. Guests gasped, some even clapped softly, unable to hide their surprise at the dramatic turn. Her husband's family tried to argue, but the lawyer cut them short with the legal proof. Every signature, every stamp, every detail confirmed her rightful ownership. Ayanda didn't need to raise her voice or insult anyone. The papers carried all the power she needed. She walked back to her seat with grace, while the same people who had laughed at her now lowered their heads in shame. The room buzzed with whispers, cameras clicked, and eyes followed her every step. In one moment, Ayanda had turned from the mocked outsider to the woman in control. The mansion they once used to disgrace her was now her crown, and she wore it with pride. Chisholm stood quietly at the edge of her husband's company party, trying not to draw attention. The hall was full of music, clinking glasses, and laughter, but her husband's proud colleagues never missed a chance to remind her she did not belong. Soon, whispers turned into sharp insults, and before she could defend herself, Her husband grabbed her arm and dragged her out in front of everyone. Gasps filled the air as she stumbled toward the door. Some guests shook their heads, others smirked, and her husband returned inside, pretending nothing had happened, as if humiliating her was just part of the show. Chisholm stood outside for a moment, her heart breaking, but she knew something they didn't. Minutes later, the doors opened again, and Chisholm walked back in, her steps firm and her face calm. At her side was a lawyer holding a file. The music stopped, and the crowd turned in surprise. The same woman who had been dragged out returned with undeniable power in her hands. The lawyer cleared his throat and announced that Chisholm's late father had left her inheritance papers, making her the majority shareholder of the very company her husband was celebrating. The room went silent. Glasses were set down, conversations froze, and her husband's confident smile melted into shock. Chisholm held up the papers for everyone to see. The legal documents carried her name, the company shares, and the official signatures proving she now had controlling power. The guests who once mocked her began to whisper in disbelief, some even clapping at the unbelievable twist. Her husband tried to argue, but the lawyer silenced him with every stamped page. Chisholm didn't need to shout or take revenge with harsh words. She simply stood tall, her dignity restored, while her husband's arrogance crumbled before the truth. Colleagues who had laughed at her minutes ago now rushed to greet her with respect, knowing she was no longer just the wife, but the woman who held the company in her hands. Phones came out, cameras flashed, and the entire party turned into a stage for her victory. The humiliation she endured only made her return more powerful. Chisholm had gone from being dragged out in shame to walking back in as the true decision-maker. That night, she didn't just claim her place, she claimed the whole boardroom, leaving her husband speechless and the entire hall stunned. At the village celebration, the drums beat loudly and the air was filled with music, laughter, and the smell of roasted food. Families gathered under the bright sun. Elders sat in their seats of honor, and children ran around with excitement. But in the middle of the joy, Amarachi's husband suddenly stood up and shouted her name. Before she could understand what was happening, he grabbed her arm and dragged her to the front, right before the elders and villagers. His words cut deep as he accused her of being worthless, of bringing nothing into the family. The crowd gasped, some whispered, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Amarachi's face burned with shame as he pushed her aside, leaving her humiliated in the very place meant for celebration. She walked away quietly, her heart heavy, but inside she carried a secret. Minutes later, as the drums slowed and the crowd still whispered about her disgrace, Amarachi returned. This time she was not empty-handed. In her grasp were papers carefully sealed, handed to her by her grandfather's lawyer. The moment she stepped forward, the whispers stopped. Even the children grew silent as she lifted the inheritance documents high. Her voice was calm but firm as she announced that her late grandfather had named her the custodian of their vast ancestral lands, fertile fields, forests, and farmlands that sustained the entire community. The elders leaned forward, their eyes wide with shock. The lawyer stepped up beside her, reading aloud the details written and signed by her grandfather before his death. The words carried weight, and no one dared to interrupt. The same woman who had been dragged and mocked moments ago now stood as the rightful keeper of the lands every family depended on. Murmurs of disbelief turned into applause, and the elders nodded their approval. Her husband's proud face turned pale, and his voice failed him when he tried to speak. Villagers who had seen her humiliation now saw her rise in strength and dignity. Women cheered, men clapped, and the elders blessed her openly, praising her grandfather's wisdom. Amarachi stood tall, no longer the woman dragged in shame, but the honored custodian of their heritage. In that moment, she didn't just restore her dignity, she claimed her rightful place as the true guardian of the land, leaving the entire village in awe. Onika had dressed beautifully for her anniversary dinner, hoping the evening would be filled with love and celebration. The luxury hotel glittered with golden lights, soft music floated in the air, and guests admired the elegant couple as they walked in. But instead of cherishing the moment, her husband grew cruel, mocking her in front of others. Soon his words turned sharper, and before anyone could stop him, he grabbed her arm and dragged her out of the dining hall. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as Onika stumbled outside, her heart breaking, her eyes burning with tears. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, while her husband returned to his seat as if nothing had happened. expecting the night to go on without her. But Onika was not as powerless as he believed. Minutes later, the doors opened again, and she walked back inside with steady steps. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. At her side was her late uncle's lawyer, holding a set of official documents. Her husband's smirk faded as the lawyer placed the papers on the table and handed them to Onika. She lifted them high, her voice calm but firm, as she revealed the truth. Her uncle had left her the hotel in his will. The very building they were sitting in, with its chandeliers, marble floors, and grand dining hall, belonged to her. The silence deepened as the lawyer read out the details, stamped and signed, confirming that Onika was the rightful owner. Guests whispered in disbelief. Some even clapped softly, impressed by the shocking twist. Her husband sat frozen, his pride shattered, unable to speak. Just moments ago he had humiliated her in front of everyone, but now the entire hotel was hers. Onika didn't need to raise her voice or argue. Her proof was louder than any insult he had thrown. She walked gracefully to the center of the room, her dignity shining brighter than the golden lights above. Guests who had pitied her moments earlier now looked at her with admiration. The same crowd that had seen her dragged away now saw her return as the true owner of the hotel. Her husband's head dropped in shame as people ignored him, turning their attention to her. Cameras flashed, whispers spread like wildfire, and Onika stood tall, proving that no one could take away her worth. In that moment, she transformed her humiliation into victory, leaving everyone stunned at the shocking revelation. Ayanda had hoped the family reunion would bring joy, laughter, and togetherness, but instead it turned into her worst nightmare. Relatives gathered under the big trees, food was served, and children played around while the elders shared stories. Suddenly, her spouse stood up and began to insult her, calling her useless in front of everyone. Before she could respond, he grabbed her arm and dragged her across the yard. The chatter stopped, and all eyes turned toward her as she stumbled, embarrassed and hurt. Some relatives laughed quietly, others whispered, while a few shook their heads, pitying her. Her heart pounded, but deep inside, she knew the truth that none of them expected. Minutes later, as the family continued pretending everything was normal, Ayanda reappeared. This time her steps were firm, her tears gone, and in her hands were papers sealed with her grandfather's signature. Everyone fell silent as she walked back into the center of the gathering. The lawyer by her side opened the folder and announced what the documents contained. Ayanda had inherited the entire estate from her late grandfather. The land, the houses, the farmland where everyone gathered, all legally belonged to her. The relatives gasped, their mouths open in shock. Her spouse's arrogant face turned pale as the lawyer read the details aloud. The documents were stamped, signed, and official, leaving no room for argument. Ayanda lifted the papers high for everyone to see, her voice steady as she declared herself the rightful landlady of the estate. The same people who had mocked her now lowered their heads, ashamed of how they had treated her. Whispers spread quickly, and some relatives clapped, impressed by the dramatic twist. Children stopped playing and ran closer, while the elders nodded in respect, recognizing her new role. Her spouse tried to speak, but no one paid him attention. Ayanda's dignity filled the space, stronger than any insult or cruelty she had endured. She stood tall, not as the humiliated woman dragged out minutes ago, but as the rightful owner of everything around them. The reunion that began with shame turned into her moment of triumph. In that instant, Ayanda transformed the humiliation into power, showing everyone that she was not only worthy of respect, she was the one who controlled the entire estate. Ijeoma stood gracefully at the charity gala, surrounded by music, bright lights, and guests dressed in their finest clothes. The hall sparkled with chandeliers as people clinked glasses and praised the night's purpose. But her husband, full of arrogance, grew impatient and cruel. He mocked her loudly, saying she had no class and didn't belong among such important people. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed her arm and dragged her across the polished floor. Gasps filled the air, whispers followed, and some guests turned away to avoid the scene. She stumbled outside, her heart heavy, her face burning with shame, while her husband returned inside, pretending he had done nothing wrong. But the night was far from over. Minutes later, the grand doors opened again, and Ijeoma walked back in. This time she wasn't alone. At her side was her late father's lawyer, holding a file with sealed papers. The laughter and chatter inside the hall stopped instantly. All eyes turned as she stepped into the center, her posture steady, her voice calm. The lawyer opened the file and announced that Igioma's late father had left her full control over the charity fund that financed the entire gala. Every light, every decoration, every program in the hall existed because of the fund that now belonged to her. The shock spread quickly. Guests who had pitied her moments ago now gasped in disbelief. The lawyer held up the stamped documents, reading out her name as the legal controller of the fund. Her husband's confident smirk vanished, replaced by panic as the truth unfolded before him. The same man who had dragged her out moments earlier now realized the event's success depended entirely on the woman he had humiliated. Igioma raised the papers high for all to see, her dignity glowing brighter than the sparkling lights above. Applause slowly began, growing louder as guests clapped for her strength and composure. The elders nodded in respect, the organizers bowed their heads, and even the musicians paused to honor her. Her husband tried to speak, but his words drowned in the clapping and murmurs of admiration directed toward her. She had entered the gala as a guest mocked by arrogance, but she now stood as the woman in charge, the very backbone of the event. The humiliation that once burned her heart turned into her shining moment of victory. Igioma had reclaimed her power, leaving everyone stunned by the breathtaking twist. Kikolomo had looked forward to her birthday celebration, imagining laughter, music, and love filling the night. The hall was decorated beautifully, the cake stood tall with candles glowing, and guests clapped as she walked in. But instead of joy, her evening turned bitter. Her husband's arrogant words cut through the air as he insulted her in front of everyone, saying she added nothing to his life. Before she could answer, he grabbed her arm roughly and dragged her across the room. Gasps echoed as she stumbled, her dress brushing the floor, and whispers spread quickly. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to interfere, while her husband returned proudly, pretending the party was his stage. Minutes later, when the music had softened and the crowd was still murmuring, the doors opened again. Kikolomo walked back in, her steps steady, her head held high. At her side was her late father's lawyer, carrying a file of important papers. The laughter faded, and silence filled the hall as all eyes turned toward her. With calm determination, she took the documents and revealed the shocking truth. Her late father had left her controlling shares in her husband's business partner's empire. The lawyer read the official details aloud, each word echoing louder than her husband's earlier insults. The room froze in disbelief. The very empire that helped build her husband's success was now in her hands. Guests gasped, some covered their mouths, and others pulled out their phones to record the unbelievable twist. Her husband's confident smile shattered, his eyes wide with fear as he realized the power she now held. The man who had mocked her only minutes before now sat powerless, exposed before everyone. Kikolomo lifted the stamped papers high, her voice clear as she declared her new position. Applause broke out slowly, then louder, until the hall echoed with cheers. Guests who had pitied her now admired her strength, clapping and nodding in respect. Her husband tried to argue, but the lawyer silenced him with undeniable proof. She had walked out humiliated, but she returned as the woman in control. The birthday meant to shame her had become her moment of triumph. Kikolomo no longer looked like the hurt wife. She stood as the powerful heiress who now held the empire in her grasp. That night, she turned betrayal into victory, leaving the entire room stunned by her rise. Chidinma had dressed elegantly for the luxury resort party, hoping the evening would be full of joy and celebration. The lights sparkled across the pool, music filled the air, and guests laughed as they enjoyed the glamorous night. But her cruel husband saw the moment as another chance to belittle her. In front of everyone, he raised his voice, calling her unworthy and embarrassing her with sharp words. Before she could defend herself, he grabbed her arm tightly and dragged her out of the hall. The crowd gasped, whispers spread quickly, and she stumbled outside with tears in her eyes. He returned proudly, pretending nothing had happened, while guests exchanged uneasy glances and shook their heads in pity. Minutes later, the doors opened again, and Chidinma walked back in. Her steps were firm, her face calm, and this time she wasn't alone. Beside her stood her late uncle's lawyer, carrying a sealed envelope. The chatter stopped instantly as all eyes turned toward her. She walked straight to the center of the hall, lifted the documents, and revealed the shocking truth. Her uncle had left her inheritance papers showing that she was the co-owner of the entire resort. The chandeliers, the grand hall, the sparkling pool outside. Everything belonged to her as much as it did to anyone else. The silence in the room was heavy as the lawyer read aloud the official details. Every page was stamped and signed, proving without doubt that she had legal rights to the property. Guests gasped, some clapped softly, and phones came out to capture the unbelievable moment. Her husband's arrogant smile faded, his eyes wide as the truth struck him harder than any insult he had thrown at her. The man who dragged her out in humiliation now realized he had embarrassed the very woman who owned half of the place. Chidinma held the papers high, her voice steady and clear, declaring her rightful place. Applause filled the room, louder with every second, as people turned from mocking her to admiring her. The same guests who had whispered about her humiliation now clapped for her strength. Her husband tried to speak, but his words drowned in the cheers and the lawyer's firm confirmation. She had been dragged out in shame, but she returned in victory. That night, Chidinma transformed her pain into power, showing the world she was not just a guest. She was the proud co-owner of the resort, leaving everyone stunned by her revelation. Ngozi stood quietly at the political rally, surrounded by loud cheers, waving flags, and powerful speeches. The stage was set, cameras flashed, and the crowd listened closely to every word. But in the middle of the excitement, her husband turned cruel. With harsh words, he insulted her in front of the supporters, saying she was nothing and had no role in the movement. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm and dragged her across the stage. The audience gasped, whispers spread quickly, and some people recorded the humiliation on their phones. She walked away with tears in her eyes, her heart breaking, but deep inside she carried a secret that would soon silence everyone. Minutes later, the noise of the rally died down as the crowd turned to the stage once again. Ngozi returned, walking with steady steps, her head high. In her hands were sealed inheritance papers, and beside her stood her late mother's lawyer. The hall grew quiet as the lawyer opened the file and began to read. The shocking truth filled the air. Ngozi's mother had been the hidden financier of the entire political party. Every campaign, every stage, every banner had been funded by her mother's wealth. And now, through inheritance, full control of the party had passed to Ngozi. The silence was powerful. Supporters who had watched her humiliation minutes earlier now looked at her with awe. The lawyer showed the stamped and signed documents, proving her authority beyond doubt. Her husband's face turned pale, his confidence collapsing in front of the very people he wanted to impress. The same man who dragged her in shame now realized the entire movement stood on her shoulders. Ngozi lifted the papers for all to see, her voice steady as she declared her rightful position. The crowd erupted with applause, chanting her name, clapping loudly, and celebrating her strength. Cameras flashed brighter, videos went viral instantly, and her husband's attempts to speak were drowned by the cheers. She no longer stood as the humiliated wife, she stood as the leader, the one who owned the future of the party. The rally that began with shame ended with her victory. Ngozi had turned humiliation into history, proving that true power could not be hidden forever. Bustias. Thank you so much for watching to the end. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.